Alright, here's the second step of wet into wet techniques or practices. So hopefully by now you have 3 different boxes. Each one has a different scene that we're painting. So it's good to have those reference images next to you. That's what you're working from. The first one is a nebula or galaxy, outer space. The second one is the sunset reflected on a lake. There's some reeds or bushes in the foreground, and then in the background there are trees, and then the last one is a tropical fish. So there's my first layer. It's dry. If you remember, we put salt on the nebula one, so it is going to be important to go ahead and get that off before you start your second layer. Wet into wet, hopefully you noticed as you came back to these drier, when the paint dries, it lightens. So you may have put on paint yesterday and you thought it was much more intense, and now today you're looking at it and you're wondering what may have happened. Well, as it dries, watercolor gets lighter. So the second layer, and you might need a third layer, you're still going to want to let it dry or dry considerably before you add into the next layer. But the second layer here is all about adding the darker values, the deeper values. So I know this picture looks like it has black, but really you want more sophisticated colors, darker values that don't have black. So my paints are already wet over here. I'm going to take some blue. I'm going to make a really dark version of blue. And to do that, I'm going to use its complement. So I'm going to add a little bit of that orange into it, and you can see how that darkened it up really nicely. I'm also going to add a little bit of violet. I don't know what it's going to do, but I'm going to experiment. I also want to make sure I have enough paint ready to go so that once it's wet, I can just drop that color in. I'm not going to have time racing against me and it drying. So wet into wet, I'm still using that technique even though this first layer is dry. I'm going to take just clean water and put a layer of water on top of it. Now it is going to loosen the color that you already have down there. That's okay. One of the key things with water or wet into wet watercolor is that you don't overwork it. So I'm trying to get as much water on there as quickly as possible. If I want, I could use a pipette to help put the water down, but I want to make sure I'm controlling where the water is, that it's even. So that has softened up some of the salt effect. I don't want to do it too much because it's going to get too dark. Or I'm sorry, it's going to blur it too much. It's going to get rid of it. So now I'm dropping in that already mixed dark color. It's not black. It is a darker version of my blue, and I just don't have enough. So I have to really quickly mix some more while this is still wet. So I'm following the photo reference. Now you're going to notice, and you're maybe thinking to yourself, there's white stars on there. Yep, we're going to get to that. That's actually going to be in the third layer. We're going to use gouache or white watercolor to do that, but you will want to make sure it's completely dry. It's a spatter technique, sometimes uncontrollable, but usually students like to do that. So we'll get there. Now, one thing I didn't mention yesterday or demonstrate in the last video is that you can blot out your color. So if you're going along here and let's say that this blue right here is a little lighter, but I put in some dark values, I can blot it back out. So if your wet into wet is not going where you want it to go, feel free to blot it back out. Also, I can add just drips of water. That will lighten areas up if it got too dark. Whatever has the most amount of moisture in it is going to take over. So if it's just water, then that's going to take over. So this is more I'm a little disappointed in the way that this red turned out. It's not as vibrant, and honestly it's just my paint set. My paint set doesn't have a really vibrant pink, but I am going to try to fix that on my last layer. So one other thing I noticed, there is a more vibrant blue in there, so I'm going to try to see on the second layer if I can drop in a little bit more blue to make that match that a little bit better. So that's it. That's my second layer. I added my darker lip colors. I intensified it. Now I'm going to move on to this landscape down here. So this landscape, you can see again the water as it dried, the watercolors faded a little bit. They're not as intense. So I'm going to not only drop in my darker values, but I'm going to try to intensify some of those sunset colors. So for this one, it's hard to tell, I think, in the video, but it is a dark green. So I'm going to mix up a really dark green. I did not wet this yet. I want to get my colors prepared first. So if I'm going to take my green and I want a dark green, I don't want to use black. Black flattens the color. I'm going to add its complement. So red's the complement of green. I'm going to take that red that's already moistened. I'm going to add a little bit of this blue. See if I can get it a little darker, maybe even this. And what I learned on the last one is I needed to mix up a lot more paint than I thought I needed because I ran out halfway through. So I do avoid black whenever possible. If you're buying your own sets of watercolors, you might want to look for a Payne's Gray. That's a really nice intense blue. I'm going to add purple or violet, see what that does. Alright, there's my really dark intense color. So it's ready to go. The other colors that I need is kind of a pure red and orange, and I notice in my set that they're dirty right now, so even though they're wet, I'm going to go out ahead and clean these so those are ready when I want to drop in that pure color. Alright, I think I'm ready to go. So I'm going to wet this entire area again. Actually, I'm going to start with the dark areas because I know those are going to be the most intense areas. So since they're going to be more intense and since they're a little bit sharper edges, I'm not going to add as much water. I don't want my dark color in this case to get really diluted, so I'm not using as much water as I used for that nebula on the top. Okay. I'm going to lay that color in. This is similar to a bleed out. If you've done that before, I'm going along that one edge with a really intense color. My landscape's probably going to take another 3 layers too, and each layer is done in a wet and wet technique. So again, patience with watercolor pays off, even though this is a quick process. I'm going to do these reeds. So instead of that dabbing motion here, I'm using more of a line that mimics the tall grass in the foreground. And then I have some dark clouds up here, so I'm going to go ahead and add those dark values. used a little bit more of that purpley dark value because that's what I'm seeing up there, the purple that I mixed. And now I'm going to drop in some of that more intense red. So here I see and orange. Keeping in mind it is going to dry a little lighter. This is a very loose style. You shouldn't feel out of control all the time though. You should have a pretty good idea where your color is going to go based on what's already wet. And then there's definitely a lot of red down here. See a little bit of a reflection there, so I'm kind of mixing in that darker value. I'm going to brighten up my red a little bit. Again, if I had a pink or an alizarin crimson in my set, my reds might be a little bit more vibrant. But I don't, so I'm just using what I have. Alright,